tries to get a handle on what used to be called, or apparently used to be called, questionable research practices, in which they are now saying, or is now called, detrimental research practices. It's not clear to me how much a change in terminology is really helpful. But they're trying to do two things overall. First is they're trying to get a sense of how common we expect questionable or detrimental research practices to be among PhD biomedical students in Europe. So that's first question. That's basically just measuring things. And then the second goal is to see to what extent other factors influence the tendency to partake in these questionable research practices. I'm going to present the paper. I don't think it's going to take too long. I'll tell you, I have not practiced this talk by any means, but I'll try and keep an eye on the time. And ideally, I'd like to have time at the end for us to talk about this, because I think that's probably where the most interesting stuff will come out from our conversations. As I said, if anything's unclear or you have any questions or some burning opinion that has to come out, then please just speak up. I'm happy to be interrupted, and as I said before, I can't actually see you, so raising your hand or anything won't actually get my attention. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that they have these two basic goals. One is to basically quantify the propensity for taking part in questionable or detrimental research practices. And the second is to see what factors may influence that propensity. And those two factors that they want to examine are basically, they want to know what happens when a student is exposed to a postdoc who's committed poor research practices in a similar situation, or when they're exposed to a supervisor who doesn't oppose such poor practice. Sorry for my unusual numbering there. Not sure what happened. So those are the two situations that they want to really look at to see whether or not basically exposure to your research environment is likely to influence your propensity to take part in poor practice. This was a COVID-inspired research project, or at least that's my reading of it. It was conducted through an online survey that used two vignette-based randomized trials. So they contacted a lot of students. I think over 600 students they got in the end. And these are students, we can look at the qualities of the students in a little bit when we present the results, but they come from about 42 different universities, I believe, all over Europe. And the students participated in an online survey. During the survey, they were provided a brief story or scenario in which the participants were asked questions to examine their research practices. Where this vignettes, the research practices they were looking at, involved detrimental research practices, and apparently they were presented as a short comic strip to, I think, make everything a bit more digestible. They considered, I think, 10 different questionable research practices, and I think it's worth briefly just kind of looking over these. These are not the same list of detrimental research practices that I've seen listed in other papers. So it seems like we have a growing or changing list of questionable research practices. The first is honorary authorship, where you add an author who doesn't qualify for authorship, or they don't meet, which means that they don't meet the established criteria put forth by the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. And so you might, for example, want to include someone on a paper who doesn't actually meet the qualifications, simply because they're famous. And if you don't have blind reviews, then having that famous person on your paper might make it easier to get the paper accepted. The second is to change the focus and or the outcome of the study. And so this is reporting statistically significant secondary outcomes as if they were primary outcomes. To me, I feel like this is somewhat related to the idea of, we'll skip to the fourth one. I feel like this is quite connected to this concept of hypothesizing after results are known, which is also known as harking. So HARK, hypothesizing after results are known. And this is a practice where you report data-driven hypotheses without disclosure to make results appear more significant. That's how they express it. Another way of expressing harking is to approach your analysis in a way where you basically explore your data. So do a whole bunch of analyses, and then based on the outcome of those analyses, create a story that you then want to report. And when you report that story, you do it in such a way that you make it sound like the story you're reporting is addressing the hypotheses you originally set out to test. And there's a couple problems with that approach. The first is that the approach is flawed because what that approach really does is it uses the data to initially generate a hypothesis and then uses the same data to essentially test that hypothesis. And you simply cannot use the same data to both generate and test a hypothesis. Logically, that doesn't work. And there's another problem, which is that when people go through this process, the data exploration involves conducting many statistical tests, but when you report the results, you're reporting a subset of those results. And so this process hides the fact that you've done many more analyses than you're actually reporting. And as a result, this essentially inflates your probability of reporting false positives, or what are technically called type 1 errors. So I see this second one, where reporting statistically significant secondary outcomes as if they're primary outcomes. I see that quite linked with hypothesizing after results are known. I'll speed up here a little bit. So exaggerating the importance of study results. So reporting conclusions exaggerate the study findings. That's self-evident. Peer review pressure. So following a peer reviewer's request to modify the study outcome or conclusions to increase the probability of acceptance by a journal. I think this might be something that's worth discussing at the end as to what extent this is actually a detrimental research practice. Salami slicing, which is publishing the same data results in 2 or more publications without disclosing this. Failing to report limitations. Phishing results, which is running multiple analyses with similar procedures and only reporting those yielding significant results. So again, that overlaps somewhat with hypothesizing after results are known in some ways. Excluding data from analyses. So in other words, basically modifying your data set in a way that increases the chances of getting small p-values. And committing mistakes in analysis. It says lacking intention to correct mistakes in the published research. So what I think that they're getting at here is, let's imagine you do an analysis and you set your paper in to be published, and then later on you discover that you made a mistake, and then you don't tell the journal that you found this mistake. You just leave it as it was originally, if that increases your chances of publication. So these are the practices that they are interested in. And here's an example of a vignette. So they provide a background where they say this student, Maria, is a PhD student in the second year of her doctoral program. She's just finished an article to her PhD project to submit to a journal. She's worked with her supervisor to design the study and 2 PhD colleagues to extract and analyze the data. She led the writing of the manuscript, and all the co-authors provided comments on earlier drafts and approved the final manuscript. The dilemma is that before submitting the article, Maria is wondering if she should include the head of the department as one of the co-authors, although they have never discussed her work with this person before. And because he is a well-known expert scientist in the field, adding his name on the list of co-authors may improve the likelihood that the article is accepted in a highly ranked journal. So that's the dilemma. And as you're going to see in a moment, there are 2 scenarios that a PhD student who is taking part in this study might need to consider. The first is where they might discuss this dilemma with a postdoctoral researcher who's been in a similar situation before and who had chosen to partake in the detrimental research practice. So in this first situation, Maria discusses with Alex, a postdoc who's been working in the department for several years, and Alex confirms that he has included the head of the department as the last author on all of his articles. So that's the first situation. The second situation is where Maria discusses the situation with her supervisor, and the supervisor tells her that he is fine with whatever she decides. So that's an example of a vignette and the situations that the PhD students who are the subjects in this study and who have to make decisions, these are the things that they have to consider. Here's a basic experimental design. We have 2 trials. So did you see a pointer when I move this around?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So on the left, we have a situation where we might be considering the postdoc situation. And on the right, we have a second trial where we're considering the supervisor's influence. And as I understand it, I think that the PhD students that partook in the study either experienced trial 1 or trial 2 and not both. So that's my understanding of what they did. In both trial cases, any participant in the study experienced 2 vignettes. First, they had to answer a question about a vignette where there was not an influence, either the postdoc or the supervisor. And then second, then they were exposed to a second vignette. And for that second vignette, it was randomly decided whether or not the participant would have to consider that second vignette either without the postdoc's influence or with the postdoc's influence. So we've got those 2 vignettes. I've already highlighted the randomization here at the second stage. So I want to highlight the purposes of these 2 stages. So the first vignette has what I think is the most interesting part of the study, where the goal here is just to measure the background rate or the background tendency to partake in a detrimental research practice. So that's what they're trying to measure from this first vignette scenario. And then the second vignette serves to see whether or not exposure to someone who has taken part in a similar detrimental research practice has an influence on the student's behavior. So that's the general experimental design. And as I said, they consider two scenarios, one where the environment is a postdoc and the other environment is a supervisor. Those are the 2 trials. The PhD students taking part in the study were asked to rank their tendency to take one solution or another. So the students were presented with two solutions. One of them was to take part in the detrimental research practice. The other one was not. And they randomly allocated whether or not the detrimental research practice was coded as solution A versus B, just in case there was any underlying bias to choose A or B for some other reason. And then they would always recode the collected data in a way that was consistent, so that the data they present in the paper goes from -5 to 5, where positive scores indicated a choice of adopting the poor practice, and negative scores indicate good practice. So those are the data. They conducted a power analysis. I won't go into all the details, but they did a power analysis, which is good. Their power analysis was to have 90% power to be able to detect a difference of 1 unit in the scale that they've got here. That was that was effectively their effect size that they were interested in, being able to discern effects that were larger than 1 unit in this scale. I don't know how they decided on the variance that they used in their power analysis. They used blinding as best they could. They said it's not possible to blind for the environmental variable, and by that it's like the aspect of whether or not you're exposed to a postdoc who or a PI who may have influenced your decisions, because just that's part of the experimental design, so that they couldn't blind to that. It's obvious whether or not you encounter this person or not based on the scenarios, but all the participants were blind to basically the hypothesis, at least for the second part of the study. So the participants were informed that the first objective of the study was to explore research practices of PhD students who are facing dilemmas. So that part was open to the participants, but students were not informed about the second objective of evaluating the impact of basically of the research environment on the decisions that PhD students make. So there was blinding to some degree in this study, and I appreciate that they were open in the paper about this topic, period, because that's a good thing. Okay, so what did they find? So who were the people that took part in this study? So just highlighting here, we have a fairly strong female bias. So about 57% of the participants were female, and 30% were male, and 1.2% were classified as other. The data came from 5 countries: France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, Finland. There's a few things I want to highlight. The first is that one of the questions that they're interested in their analysis is whether or not the pressure to publish, whether or not the pressure that the subject in the study experiences to publish, whether or not that influences their behavior. And so from that perspective, we've got a fairly good scenario to test that hypothesis, because about half of the participants felt that there was a great deal of pressure on them to publish, which means we have good variation in the population of subjects to test that hypothesis. If almost all the students had either a lot of pressure or very little pressure, then we'd have very little statistical power to be able to test that hypothesis as to whether or not pressure to publish influences your behavior. There's also another number here that caught my eye, which I thought was quite interesting, which is just that 61% had actually received training on research integrity. I'd be interested in knowing, just as part of our discussion later, what you think that number is here at the University of Edinburgh. I don't know that number for even within the school that I teach in. So I'm actually relatively impressed by this number of 61%. But again, from an experimental design standpoint, this is a fairly good number because it means that we have a lot of students who have had training and also a large proportion of the students who have not had training. And that means that the qualities of the subjects give us greater experimental power to test for an effect of research, to test for an effect of this experience on the students' behaviors. And then these data here, I'm also interested in for similar reasons. They're just describing how often research integrity training is provided in their institution. And you can see that most of the time, so about 65%, students only receive training once during their PhDs, but about a fifth of students got training once a year, which is pretty good. So that's the background in terms of who participated in the study as subjects. This is, I think, the last slide, just about how they went about doing what they did. It just describes the analysis. So when they're looking at the effect of exposure to a postdoc or not, or a PhD or a PI or not, they considered that exposure in their analysis as what's called a fixed effect, or they refer to that as a group effect. Since they had many different vignettes, they included vignette as a random effect in their analysis. And they also allowed for there to be what's called an interaction between the group and the vignette. So what that essentially means is they allow the analysis to look for differences in the effective group, depending on which vignette you're considering. So it's possible that for some detrimental research practices, so for some vignettes, exposure to a postdoc might have an effect, whereas in other cases, it might not. And so by allowing this interaction in their analysis, that allows for those kinds of insights to be revealed. So that's one aspect of their analysis. They also wanted to know how the intervention, so exposure to a PI or a postdoc, how that affects the risk of adopting a detrimental research practice. And to do this, they stepped away from a scale of 1 to 5 and basically said that if someone had a score of 1 or greater, then they would use that for deciding whether or not a student chose to adopt a detrimental research practice. So if a student chose the detrimental research practice with a score of 1 or greater, then they would say yes, they adopted the detrimental research practice, and they'd code that outcome from the student as a 1. Otherwise, they'd say they did not. The subject did not choose the detrimental research practice, and they'd code the outcome for their analysis as a 0. And then they analyzed the data with a binomial model and a generalized estimating equation framework, which is not something I'm very familiar with. I think it's kind of a semi-parametric or semi-non-parametric approach to analyzing data. And they present the results from 2 different perspectives, either as an absolute risk difference in proportions or as relative risk. The results are really quite similar. From my perspective, these are really just 2 different ways of looking at the same data. So I'm just going to present results from the first thing. They also did some post hoc analyses where they wanted to know whether or not gender, research experience, training on research integrity and pressure to publish influenced the students' behavior in general. And that's what we got. Here's our first general result, which is basically, how many students did they get? They had 630 students overall, and those were evenly allocated to either the postdoc or the supervisor scenarios. So 315 students in each. And then they had relatively balanced sample size as to whether or not someone was experienced intervention from a peer, so the PI or the postdoc or not. So these are our sample sizes, and then these bits down here just note that some people may not have actually completed the survey. At least that's my understanding of things. So it gives a sense of their overall sample size for all their data, and it's roughly around 150 measurements for each of the possible situations. Okay, so this is what I think they present as their main result slide. And what this slide is, or what this figure shows, is the overall tendency for students. So I'm not saying this very well. If you remember, go way back here, they had this first vignette where students were presented with a situation, and the goal at this stage was just to determine the overall propensity of PhD students to partake in a detrimental research practice. Okay, that was a primary goal of the study. And at that stage, and in later stages, students had to rank their decision from, definitely choosing one solution to definitely choosing another solution using a scale of 1 to 5. This figure presents those data, and I'll just walk you through the colors here. So the reddish colors indicate times when a student chose the detrimental research practice. Where the lighter color, like it indicates 1, where they maybe would choose a detrimental research practice, and the dark color is where they've definitely chosen to do the detrimental research practice. And then the blue is the opposite. And I think there's 2 main outcomes that we can see here. The first is there's an awful lot of red, which indicates that there's often a high background probability of willingness to participate in detrimental research practices, which is probably worrying for most people listening to this. The second thing, which is not surprising, is that the probability of being willing to participate in a detrimental research practice seems to depend on the situation that we're considering. So let's take a moment and just consider the scenarios that were most enticing to students. So the 2 situations where students were most likely to participate in detrimental research practice was salami slicing. So that again is where the students would be willing to publish the same results in more than one paper without being open about that. And you can see that about 2/3 of students had a tendency to choose this detrimental research practice. That's all of these observations here. So there's a high propensity to be willing to do this overall. Tied with that as the most common detrimental research practice is to exaggerate the importance and the practical applicability of the findings. That was also at 66%. Um,
And so I'm curious, Crispin, this is obviously for postgraduate students, but I wonder what sorts of surveys like this have been done for researchers, as a whole, or, more senior level PIs, etc. Because I think what's encouraging to see is there's very low percentages of things like excluding data from the analysis or not reporting limitations.
yeah.
My impression is those are more clear, like black and white cases of unethical practices. Like if you're excluding data so that you get a significant result, that's pretty clearly unethical. I really think a lot of people misunderstand harking, and often it's seen as just like creative thinking and like, oh, I'm using my expertise as, an expert in this field to interpret unexpected results. And, the conclude. But that point you made earlier about you can't generate hypotheses and test them from the same data set, I think a lot of people, that just passes over people's heads, sort of.
Yep.
So yeah, this chimes with what I would have expected mostly, and even the one about exaggerating the importance of your findings. I mean, a lot of people just see that as like selling things, I think that reflects the way that research is valued based on sort of subjective importance and impact rather than robustness. So that's maybe just a broader cultural issue.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with everything you said.
Yeah, there's quite a lot. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'll take one thing you said and really just kind of restate it in different words, but same message, where a lot of the time I think people take part in these practices often because they don't understand what it is they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
They don't understand what the actual implications for their actions are for reproducibility.
And this, I don't know if you can see the chat, you often can't when you're presenting, but there's a few comments echoing that in the chat. Many people don't view harking as a bad thing. And often when I talk about research integrity and I mention harking, people are just sort of like, oh, well, that's just part of interpreting unexpected findings. And it's like, well, it is, but you have to be aware that you then need to design a new experiment to test if that's actually real. It's not just random. But yeah.
It's amazing to me because what that really shows, I'm going to make myself, so I'll say something, then I'm going to make a confession. I think that what that scenario that you're describing, what it shows is a basic misunderstanding of the scientific process. It's a basic misunderstanding of how we go about coming to appropriate conclusions. And so that's my statement. My confession is that I never thought about these things until I actually had to start teaching them. So, it was only, a few years ago that I really became aware of what harking was and when I realized that it was bad. And as soon as I learned about it, I realized, okay, I need to teach about this because this is clearly bad, but it's something that I hadn't known about. I mean, to a certain degree, it's often what, I was taught to do when I was an undergrad. I remember when I took my first stats course this would have been, well, a long time ago in the 1990s. And the first thing that we were told to do in our stats class was basically to explore your data. Just look at everything, see what's there. And then they would say, from that, then you can start to get a sense of what's going on. And what I just described there is exactly what I described as being harking earlier. So I agree. I think in some cases it's like we're even taught to do things that are wrong.
And actually, with the proliferation of like omics capabilities for transcriptomics, proteomics, any of these sort of unbiased or like hypothesis-free analytical approaches, the goal is to generate hypotheses usually. Sometimes it's to test a hypothesis, but more often than not, these things are generating new ideas, which then, but they're expensive. So by the time you've done that, it's hard to then do a repeat experiment to test if it's reproducible or to dig further. But it's almost like the technology is sort of encouraging this way of interpreting data without people being aware of the limitations.
Yeah. I think the useful thing about these data that we're presenting, though, is it does give us a sense of basically the lay of the land. It's people who conduct research, and these data give us a sense of the qualities of that population who's conducting research. And so it gives us potentially useful insight onto, why we have low reproducibility. I mean, I don't want to put too much weight on that statement. But I think, understanding the qualities of the people conducting research is important to understand why research turns out as it does. And so that's why I think this paper is useful. Sorry, just a second. I'll be right back. Someone take a break for a moment. I need to answer the door.
So I don't know if anybody else wants to speak up now while we have this little intermission. We are still recording. I think the usual policy is that by the time we get to the end of the speaker's presentation, we stop the recording and then open it up for discussion. But if anybody wants to type anything in the chat or say anything, then maybe we have a few seconds for that. Mm-hmm.
Hi there, Stefano here. Yes, I think what you were saying is very on point, and as I mentioned in the chat, like I've seen a lot of students. So I'm in the linguistics and English language department, and I deal with all things stats basically in the department. I teach the stats courses, I provide help to students, and I get students like sometimes coming to me saying, I ran this model, but then the model told me that the hypothesis that we had, initially was not correct, as they say. So I was suggested now to rewrite my chapter based on the results of this particular model. And then I try to explain to them, that is hacking and it's not ideal. And then they say, but my supervisor told me that, I have to show that I understand theory fully. And if I don't reframe the chapter theoretically, then it's going to look bad. So I think it's really encouraged to reframe things theoretically, because you have to show your understanding of theory, whatever theory means. So I think that misunderstanding comes possibly partially from this aspect, that it's theory that drives what you write. Of course, we also need to think that data analysis, cannot exist by itself, and it impacts theory as much as theory impacts data analysis. So yeah, I really think that that's why a lot of people do hacking without knowing that it's bad, because they think they're doing good theory.
Makes sense. I'm back, just for the record.
Okay, and we should maybe move on to see what the outcomes of the interventions are, to see how it changes things. I'm conscious of the time, and we want some discussion.
It'll just take me a moment to get through the rest of this. One last point to make here. So, Will, you pointed out how students are less willing to do things like to exclude data from the analysis. I agree. I still find these worrying numbers. I mean, the fact that 15% of students indicated that they were willing to exclude data from analysis, I mean, that's still a lot from my perspective. But sorry, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth earlier to say that you thought that this wasn't worrying. And I think you were just pointing out some things clearly had less of a tendency to partake in these detrimental practices. I'm taking it that that's what you meant earlier.
Yeah,
and I agree.
It's still not great, but I'm not surprised that things like harking and not the salami slicing are more common.
Yeah. You asked earlier about what we find in other studies, and here's an example from a paper that came out in 2018. So this is for people in ecology and evolution, and this paper followed on some work in psychology. And I can say that the results from this paper are consistent with the psychology papers that were published earlier, and they have a slightly different list of questionable research practices. But the overall range that we see here is, pretty much mirrors what we have up from the students. So we have a small fraction of people who have admitted to conducting data fabrication. So that's just making up data. Switching analyses, that's around 50%. Excluding data, that's around 25%, whereas it was 15% with the students. Rounding p-values or having unreported models, I mean, that's along the lines of like the phishing. So that's like 25 to 50%. Harking is around 50%, similar to what it was in the students. So overall, what we find among PIs in this field and in psychology is not that different from what's being reported for the PhD students.
And Crispin, we have a question in the chat from Fiona about what's the color code in that second graph, the light versus the dark blue?
Oh, it's ecology versus evolution. These were two different disciplines. Yeah. So that's the main result from this. In terms of what were the results of the interventions, so interaction with a postdoc or with a PI, they actually found no evidence that exposure to a postdoc or exposure to a PI who was willing to let these detrimental practices occur, they found that those interventions there's no evidence that those interventions had any influence on the students' behavior. So I've just, copied and pasted what they have here. So for the postdoc, the mean for the vignettes with or without the postdoc was minus 0.4 versus minus 0.5. And so they have a p-value of 0.6 for that comparison. What they do point out is that there does tend to be variation among the disciplines, among the vignettes for an effect of the postdoc, but nothing particularly strong. And then you get a similar scenario with the supervisor. With the supervisor, it does seem that, I think these are 95% confidence intervals, it does seem like we have evidence for an interaction between the presence or absence of the supervisor in the vignette. But overall, there's no strong effect of the supervisor at all. And the overall p-value is really doesn't supply any evidence for an effect of supervisor. The last thing that I want to highlight is, that they looked at these what they call post hoc tests. So they wanted to know whether or not there was an effective female versus male or research experience or training on research integrity or pressure to publish. None of these things, if you look at the p-values, none of these things influence the student's behavior. And the thing that I find most shocking is what I've highlighted in green, which is whether or not you have training on research integrity appears to have no influence on the student's behavior at all. I mean, the p-value is about as high as you can get, 0.99. So I think that is really worth thinking about. So I just decided, for getting to their discussion, I just copied and pasted this. So things to highlight is the most frequently chosen detrimental research practices were exaggerating the importance of the findings, salami slicing, and phishing. And so they highlight these as potential situations that we can direct our attention to. The big reason why I took this part of their discussion is to highlight that their study also indicated that nearly half of the students were under considerable pressure to publish. And they think, although I don't think they had any statistical evidence for this, well, they didn't, but they seem to claim that the pressure to publish might impact the research practice of PhD students. And so one of the things I thought we might discuss is whether or not registered reports might be a nice avenue for PhD students, especially to follow, to reduce some of that pressure. So this is the last slide. Two main results from this paper. The first is we have a general sense now of what the propensity for these detrimental research practices are. They're pretty high, but depends on the situation. In other words, depends on the particular practice we're talking about. And second, we found no evidence for an effect of a postdoc on their behavior. And so now I just wanted to know what your thoughts were in the time we have left.
Okay, so we'll open up to discussion. I'll just stop the recording now and thank